For more than a century, one of the most famous faces in human history has been sitting inside a German museum, and almost nobody visiting it realized that underneath that flawless painted surface was a completely different face entirely. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what a hidden scan revealed inside the Nefertiti bust, and why that discovery quietly reopened a controversy museum officials have spent decades trying to avoid. Before we continue, hit subscribe now, because everything in this video comes from real scientific imaging, documented research papers, and statements made directly by the scientists involved, not internet speculation dressed up as fact. The Nefertiti bust is arguably one of the most recognizable artifacts to survive from ancient Egypt, instantly identifiable by its elegant blue crown, striking symmetry, and calm, almost serene expression. It has been housed for decades inside the Neues Museum in Berlin, protected behind reinforced glass, kept under carefully controlled lighting and humidity, and the bust was originally unearthed in 1912 by a German archaeological team working at Amarna, the short-lived capital city built by the pharaoh Akhenaten, Nefertiti's husband, during a dramatic period of religious upheaval in ancient Egyptian history. The discovery was led by archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt, and from the very beginning, questions swirled around exactly how the artifact left Egypt and made its way into a private German collection before eventually becoming part of a state museum. Egyptian authorities have argued for decades that the export of the bust involved deliberately misleading documentation at the time, downplaying its significance so it would not attract the scrutiny that a masterpiece of this caliber deserved. Germany has consistently denied any wrongdoing and maintained that the bust left the country through fully legal channels under the export laws in place at the time. That dispute alone has fueled one of the longest-running cultural property arguments in modern archaeology. But the scanning research took the controversy somewhere nobody fully expected. At the time of the original excavation, Egypt operated under a system known as the partage arrangement, in which artifacts discovered by foreign expeditions were divided between the excavating country and the Egyptian Antiquities Authority overseeing the dig. Under that system, foreign teams were generally allowed to keep a portion of what they uncovered, provided the split was conducted fairly and transparently. Critics of Borchardt have long argued that the way the bust was described and photographed at the time of division deliberately understated its condition and craftsmanship, making it appear far less significant than it actually was, which allegedly allowed the German team to claim it as part of their share without Egyptian officials fully understanding what they were giving up. Defenders of Borchardt counter that record-keeping standards of the period were simply inconsistent across the board, and that no clear evidence has ever surfaced, proving intentional deception occurred during the official division process itself. In order to understand what the scan actually revealed, you first need to understand what the bust is physically made of. Unlike a piece of granite or solid stone that has been carved directly into shape, the Nefertiti bust is built around an inner core made of limestone, which was then carefully covered with multiple layers of hand-applied plaster or stucco to create the final smooth surface visitors see today. That plaster layer is where the fine detail lives, the delicate curve of the cheekbones, the shape of the lips, the subtle structure around the eyes. In simple terms, the limestone forms the rough skeleton, while the stucco forms the face the entire world recognizes. Because the surface is fragile and irreplaceable, researchers have never been able to physically cut into the bust to examine what lies underneath that outer stucco layer. For years, that meant the internal structure remained essentially a mystery, hidden beneath a surface nobody was willing to damage in order to satisfy scientific curiosity. That changed once medical-grade computed. Tomography scanning became advanced enough to see through solid material without causing any physical harm at all. The same underlying technology used every day in hospitals to look inside the human body without ever needing to make a single incision. In 2006, a research team led by radiologist Alexander Huppertz used a CT scanner to capture an extraordinarily detailed set of cross-sectional images of the bust, layer by layer, essentially building a complete three-dimensional map of everything hidden underneath the painted surface. What they found did not match the smooth, idealized face familiar from museum photographs and postcards. Buried beneath the visible stucco was a noticeably different limestone core, one with less symmetrical cheekbones, visible, creases running from the nose toward the corners of the mouth, and a slightly less pronounced jawline than the finished exterior suggested. Getting permission to run the scan at all required extensive negotiation, since the museum was understandably cautious about allowing any procedure that involved moving one of its most valuable and fragile holdings outside of its usual secure display environment, even temporarily. The bust was eventually transported under tightly controlled conditions to a nearby medical imaging facility, escorted by conservators and security personnel, and scanned using equipment typically reserved for detailed diagnostic imaging of the human skull. The entire procedure was carried out with extraordinary caution, since even minor vibration or temperature fluctuation carried real risk of damaging a plaster surface that had already survived more than 3,000 years. The resulting data set consisted of hundreds of individual cross-sectional slices, later combined digitally to reconstruct a complete internal model of the bust from every possible angle, something that would have been entirely impossible using traditional physical examination methods alone. In other words, the face carved directly into the underlying stone was subtly different from the face the ancient sculptor ultimately presented to the world. The stucco layer had been deliberately used to soften and idealize certain features, smoothing out asymmetries, adjusting the line of the nose, and creating the flawless symmetry that has made this particular bust so celebrated for the last 100 years. Researchers were quick to point out that this was not evidence of deception or forgery on the part of ancient sculptors. Applying plaster to refine a stone carving was an established Egyptian technique at the time, and using an underlying rough form covered by a more finished exterior mirrors known production. Methods documented in other artifacts from the same era. Even so, the discovery meant the bust the entire world had been looking at for over a century was not simply a faithful direct carving. It was a carefully finished composite, and the true unaltered face lay hidden just beneath the surface the whole time. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem, because it directly challenges one of the most repeated claims about the bust, the idea that it represents an almost photographic, unfiltered likeness of Nefertiti exactly as she appeared in life. The scan complicated that narrative considerably. If the sculptor working 3,000 years ago deliberately adjusted proportions and softened features during the final finishing stage, then what museum visitors have been looking at is not a raw historical record. It is, in a very real sense, an ancient example of retouching, a curated version of a real woman's face, rather than an unedited copy of it. This detail fed directly into a separate and considerably more explosive debate that had already been simmering for years before the scan results were published, the question of whether the entire bust might be a modern forgery rather than a genuine 3,000-year-old artifact at all. A small number of researchers and art historians have argued over the decades that certain stylistic and technical details of the bust do not perfectly match other confirmed Amarna period artifacts, raising the uncomfortable possibility that Ludwig Borchardt himself, or someone working closely with him, may have created or heavily altered the piece sometime in the early 20th century before presenting it as an authentic ancient find. Supporters of this theory point to a handful of unusual details. The bust's left eye is famously missing its inlaid pupil, while the right eye retains its detailed coloring, an asymmetry that has never been fully explained and would be unusual for a finished ceremonial piece intended for display. They also note that the surviving excavation records from the original 1912 dig contain fewer independent cross-references confirming the bust's exact discovery context than researchers would typically expect for a find of this magnitude and importance. None of this amounts to definitive proof of forgery, and the overwhelming majority of Egyptologists firmly reject the idea, pointing to material analysis that consistently matches known ancient pigments and construction techniques used during the Amarna period, specifically. But the scan results, showing a hidden layer that does not perfectly match the finished exterior, gave skeptics fresh material to point toward, even though mainstream researchers interpret that same evidence as entirely consistent with authentic ancient sculpting practices, rather than any form of deception. The most vocal proponent of the forgery theory over the years has been a researcher named Henri Stierlin, who published a book arguing that Borchardt himself may have commissioned the bust as a demonstration piece intended to show ancient Egyptian sculpting techniques to a visiting dignitary, only for it to later be mistaken, deliberately or otherwise, for a genuine ancient artifact. Stierlin pointed to what he described as inconsistencies in early photographs and correspondence surrounding the bust's initial documentation. The Egyptian Museum in Berlin has firmly rejected this theory, releasing detailed statements citing pigment analysis, tool mark comparisons, and material dating consistent with genuine 18th dynasty craftsmanship. Independent material. Scientists who have since reviewed the available data have generally sided with the museum's position, though the theory continues to resurface periodically in documentaries and online discussions, partly because the missing eye and the unusual excavation paperwork remain genuinely unresolved details that skeptics can always point back toward. Beyond the forgery debate, the CT data opened up an entirely different and considerably less controversial area of research, allowing scientists to study the internal construction methods used by ancient Egyptian sculptors with a level of precision that had simply never been possible before. The scans revealed subtle tool marks preserved within the limestone core, providing insight into exactly how the original rough shape was carved before the finishing layers were applied. Researchers were able to measure the thickness of the stucco at different points across the face, discovering that certain areas, particularly around the cheeks and the bridge of the nose, carried noticeably thicker layers of plaster than others. That variation suggests the sculptor was not simply applying a uniform coating for protection or decoration. He was using the plaster layer as an active sculpting tool in its own right, building up specific areas to intentionally reshape the final appearance in ways the underlying stone alone could not achieve. This finding actually lines up with something Egyptologists have long suspected about royal portraiture from this particular period of Egyptian history. The reign of Akhenaten, Nefertiti's husband, is often described as one of the most experimental and stylistically unusual periods in the entirety of ancient Egyptian art. Early representations of the royal family from this era feature deliberately exaggerated, almost elongated features, a striking departure from the traditionally rigid and idealized style used in earlier dynasties. Some historians believe this shift reflected a genuine religious and artistic revolution centered around the worship of the sun disk Aten, while others argue it may have simply reflected the personal artistic preferences of the specific sculptors working in the royal workshop at the time. Regardless of the underlying reason, the era was clearly one where artists felt comfortable deviating from centuries of established convention, which makes the discovery of a deliberately reshaped, idealized final layer on the Nefertiti bust considerably less surprising in proper historical context. The workshop where the bust was found is itself worth understanding because it changes how the discovery is typically interpreted. Excavators identified the building as belonging to a sculptor named Thutmose, based on an ivory horse blinker inscribed with his name and title found among the surrounding debris. The site contained numerous other unfinished busts, plaster casts, and partially completed royal portraits, strongly suggesting this was a working artistic studio rather than a temple or storage facility. That context matters considerably, because it implies the Nefertiti bust may never have been intended as a completed, publicly displayed religious object at all. Many researchers now believe it functioned instead as a master reference model, a template kept in the workshop and used by sculptors to guide the production of other official royal portraits, distributed elsewhere throughout the kingdom. If that interpretation is correct, the missing eye pupil may simply reflect its unfinished status as a working studio tool, rather than any evidence of deception or later tampering. Researchers involved in the scanning project have been careful to emphasize that none of this diminishes the artistic and historical significance of the piece. If anything, it deepens it considerably. Rather than functioning as a simple mechanical copy of a real face, the bust now appears to represent a genuinely skilled sculptor's deliberate artistic interpretation, blending observed reality with an idealized standard of royal beauty specific to that particular moment in Egyptian history. In some ways, that makes the piece even more remarkable, because it demonstrates an extraordinary level of technical control, the ability to build a nuanced, refined final image out of a rougher underlying structure using nothing more than hand tools and natural plaster, achieving a level of polish that still captivates viewers more than 3,000 years later. The scanning technology used in this particular study has continued to improve significantly since the original 2006 research was first published, and more recent imaging passes have added even finer detail to the overall picture. Higher resolution scans have allowed researchers to identify extremely faint traces of pigment beneath the outer painted layer, hinting at possible earlier versions of the coloring that may have existed before the final finish was applied, though this specific area of research remains ongoing and far from conclusive. Some researchers have also used the detailed scan data to produce highly accurate physical reconstructions of the hidden limestone core, effectively allowing people to see, for the first time in 3,000 years, an approximation of what the underlying face looked like before any of the finishing work took place. When these reconstructions were first put on public display, museum visitors were often visibly surprised by just how different that hidden face appeared, compared to the version that they had grown up seeing on postcards, book covers, and countless documentaries. That contrast raises a genuinely interesting question worth sitting with for a moment. Which version actually represents the real Nefertiti, the finished, idealized bust admired by millions, or the rougher, more human face hidden underneath it for over 3,000 years? Ancient Egyptian art was rarely intended to function as documentary photography. Royal portraiture in particular was deeply symbolic, designed to project divine authority, eternal beauty, and political legitimacy, rather than simply record exact physical appearance. Under that framework, the finished bust visitors admire today may represent precisely what it was always meant to be, not a flawed attempt at photographic accuracy, but a carefully constructed statement about how a queen wished to be remembered for eternity. Even so, the ongoing debate surrounding the bust's provenance has not gone away, and if anything, the renewed scientific attention brought about by the scanning research has added fresh fuel to Egypt's long-standing calls for its permanent return. Egyptian officials have repeatedly requested that Germany repatriate the bust, arguing it represents an irreplaceable piece of national heritage, that circumstances that remain genuinely disputed to this day. German museum authorities have consistently declined these requests, citing both the legal basis of the original export and concerns about the bust's extreme physical fragility, arguing that the piece is far too delicate to survive international transport safely. That standoff has continued for well over a decade with no clear resolution in sight, and the renewed public attention generated by the scanning research has only added further pressure to an already sensitive diplomatic situation between the two countries. The Nefertiti case is far from unique in this regard, and it sits alongside a growing list of similarly contested artifacts currently held in major Western museums, far from the countries where they were originally discovered. The Rosetta Stone, currently housed in the British Museum, has faced repeated repatriation requests from Egypt for decades, with museum officials there offering broadly similar justifications regarding legal acquisition and conservation concerns. The Parthenon marbles, held by the same museum but claimed by Greece, represent perhaps the most widely publicized example of this exact same underlying dispute, one involving different countries and different artifacts, but following an almost identical pattern of colonial-era acquisition, followed by decades of diplomatic requests and equally consistent institutional refusal. What makes the Nefertiti case particularly notable within this broader pattern is how directly modern scientific analysis intersected with the ownership debate, effectively adding a scientific dimension to what had previously been an argument confined almost entirely to legal documents and historical correspondence. Some legal scholars who study cultural property disputes have pointed out that the scanning research inadvertently strengthened Egypt's position in an indirect but meaningful way, by demonstrating that the bust is even more artistically sophisticated and historically significant than previously understood, containing an entire hidden layer of craftsmanship nobody had fully appreciated. Before, the research reinforced exactly the kind of argument repatriation advocates have used for years, that objects of this cultural importance belong in the country where they were created and where the broader historical context surrounding them can be properly preserved and presented. Museum. Representatives in Berlin have pushed back against that framing, arguing that the bust's presence in Germany has allowed exactly this kind of advanced scientific study to take place in the first place, made possible by direct access to specialized medical imaging facilities and research funding that might not have been as readily available elsewhere. What makes this story particularly compelling is how a purely scientific tool, originally developed for medical diagnostics inside hospitals, ended up reshaping a decades-old cultural and historical argument in a completely unexpected direction. Nobody using a CT scanner to study Royal Egyptian sculpture in the mid-2000s was setting out to reignite questions about repatriation or authenticity. They were simply trying to understand how an ancient artifact had actually been constructed. Yet the moment that hidden layer beneath the surface became visible, it added an entirely new dimension to a debate that had already been running for the better part of a century, proving once again that even our most thoroughly studied historical treasures can still hold secrets nobody thought to look for until the right technology finally came along. Today, the Nefertiti bust remains exactly where it has sat for decades, carefully preserved behind reinforced glass inside the Neues Museum, still drawing enormous crowds every single year, most of whom have no idea that a completely different face sits, quietly hidden just beneath the one they came to see. Museum staff report that visitor numbers actually climbed noticeably in the years following widespread media coverage of the scan results, suggesting that far from diminishing public fascination with the piece, the discovery of its hidden layer only deepened it. The next time you come across a photograph of that famous crowned face, it is worth remembering that what you are looking at is not simply an ancient sculpture. It is a carefully finished illusion, layered deliberately over a rougher, more human truth that stayed completely invisible for more than 3,000 years, until a hospital scanning machine finally exposed it to the world. If stories exploring hidden secrets behind history's most famous artifacts genuinely interest you, make sure to hit like on this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss whatever gets uncovered next.